Alright, so Mormon fans, this video is really just a conversation that Aaron and I had. Aaron Vierv, he's a friend of mine who was LDS and later became more atheist and now has since returned to agnosticism. It was really cool. I was just on a road trip. I was driving down to California and I decided to call him and we were just talking, and after the phone call, I really had wished that we had recorded it. I was like, oh man, I really wish that we'd recorded this phone call. And he's like, actually, I have an app on my phone that just records all my calls. Maybe it's recorded. And so it was, and he sent it over to me. The audio quality is fairly poor, and especially listening to me, it's going to be very difficult to hear. But I thought that Aaron's input and commentary on how he now views religion and God and all those different things interesting and intriguing. So I would encourage you to listen to him, and if you have some time, and hopefully maybe in the future we'll do it again with a better mic. But anyway, if you have some time to kill and you want to listen to a former Mormon's view on how religion and God play in the world today, you might be interested in this. Enjoy.
Totally.
Yeah, but no, I
just
recommend it.
Went to lunch with Brian McKnight. I went to lunch with him in Las Vegas on the way through.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. Talked to him about his life and his spiritual experiences and how he rectifies or justifies them now and all that kind of cool stuff that I do. I didn't interview him for like the video or anything, but just shot the bull with him and took him to lunch. So it was good.
Yeah. No, that's fair. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of felt like, he was one of those like super staunch Mormons that, it's all black and white, it's all true, there's nothing false about it,
Yeah.
And then like, the prophets couldn't physically say anything wrong, like it would be possible. And then he found out something about polygamy and polyandry with Pete Rise and Joseph Smith, and that's kind of like where it all started for him.
Interesting. I always think it's fascinating. Everybody hits their thing differently, right? Like it's different for Chase, different for me, Greg. Like it's just because I knew pretty much like all of that, everything that people consider like, oh my God, this is crazy, right? Like whether it's like, black people or polygamy or whatnot, it's like I was well aware of all of that. So I was like, for me it wasn't a surprise. Yeah. No, it's interesting though. Like I said, everybody, I think, I don't know, everybody's different.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a larger part of his undoing, not the right way to put it, but a larger part of his falling away, I think that he has a question of why God would allow suffering. Like, that's like the main, I mean, at the core, that's one of the main things that it doesn't think there could be a God that would allow such suffering.
No, I hear that. I mean, that's what did it for Bart Airman. I don't know if you're familiar with Bart Airman. I'm a pretty big fan of his. He's a New Testament scholar. He really knows his shit, but he started off as pretty much like fundamentalist Christian, then kind of liberal Christian, and then, eventually the agnostic camp. But what did it for him, he said, was, because I mean, like, he goes into it from like the Southern Baptist point of view, where it's like, the Bible is inerrant, perfect word of God, yada yada. Gets into like, well, I want to study the Bible for a living, scholarship, and then he's like, wow, there's a lot of errors in here, right? And then he kind of segues to more of like a liberal Christian point of view, where he was happy to like accept the fact that the Bible is flawed, but also, still retaining a faith in Christ. But for him, what did it for him was also the suffering and whatnot. So, yeah, no, it is interesting.
What is your opinion on that, because I feel that like dogmatism is the undoing for a lot of people, but at the same point, there's a lot of power within dogmatism. You know, like there's a lot of, I don't know, control. There's a lot of, I don't know the right way to put it, but it's almost like dogmatism can inspire a lot of people to have a really faith and inspires you to do incredibly good things. But at the same time, it feels like it's not the right way of doing it, and that's why it causes people's testimony or faith in God to crash. Is that?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. Personally, like how I see it and stuff, I think Bruce Lee kind of summed it up best and stuff when he talks about people who are hard and rigid. They're like oak trees, right? And so that's kind of how I look at, like a dogmatic point of view, right? Is they're really grounded, right? It's a strong, stable oak tree. But the thing with an oak tree is you add enough of a storm, like a big enough storm, and because it's so rigid, it cracks underneath it, because it happens to be essentially like I'm either going to like make or break the situation, right? It's either like an absolute yes or an absolute no. And you see that with a lot of people who go from kind of a very fundamentalist approach to religion to like they kind of rubber band to the other extreme and being some of the more staunched in the atheist crowd, right? Because I mean, that's all they've known their life is to take a very hardline, dedicated approach to something, right? And so it's more of a personality thing where it's like, I'm committed all the way, it's 100% like this. And then when their tree breaks, it's like, oh shit, right? And so they go the complete other way. As opposed to somebody like Bruce Lee says it's more like a willow tree, where like a willow tree in a storm will bend and survive. So it's flexible. And it's flexibility that it allows it to weather the storm.
Yeah. Do you like him? I think that's interesting, because like when I was talking to him, he was saying that like in a way he feels blessed that his parents raised him like an oak tree. Say those words.
Yeah.
The way he feels blessed is he was raised like an oak tree because that he had that clean break. He doesn't, where he felt. Said something along the lines of feeling sorry for me because I was brought up in like a convert mom with a adulterer dad. I feel bad calling that, but and a house that was like sick. Like I saw the good and the bad, so that allowed me to kind of be more forgiving in my viewpoint.
Yeah, no, of course.
Like so likely you'll be in it longer, and obviously from the current standpoint, you think that that's not a good thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody's different, right? And so I can see where you and I have a much more similar background than, me and Ryan McKnight, or me and the people from, the Zelf on the Shelf people.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, where it's like they were very much the oak trees as opposed to the willow trees. Like for me and stuff, like I didn't have like a break moment. Like that's never what I had. It's more of just like having conversations, and for me trying to be committed to intellectual honesty and truth and putting, truth ahead of my beliefs. So that's what I was trying to do and stuff. And so, especially too in like critical thinking class, we're like, learn like, okay, try to assume your opponent's position and try to defend it, right? Or do like what the guys in the intellectual dark web call it, of like steel manning your opponent's position. So rather than painting a straw man, try to steel man it, give the best version possible, things like that, right? And so for me, it was just like a really engaging with ideas kind of thing, and like just coming to like realize, like for me, it was just I couldn't quite justify it in the way that I thought was sufficient. And so that's kind of what it was for me. But also too, I still see, as opposed to maybe some of the more hardline new atheists, in a lot of utility for religion. I don't know. Do you ever listen to Ben Shapiro's Sunday specials?
No, I don't think I have.
they're phenomenal. But what he does on his Sunday specials is he's got like a different guest he'll have on, and he'll sit down and have, and he calls it, the conversation. And so he'll talk with different people and whatnot. And I like it because he talks with, both conservatives and liberals, not leftists, right? So, but he's had on, like Michael Shermer, Sam Harris, and today he had on Eric Weinstein, and they're really good. They're really good conversations, and I like the fact that he'll dive into details with position. Like, I mean, Michael Shermer had some of his fan base shitting on him because he said Michael essentially, and it was a good cordial conversation, right? All of these are good, even when they disagree. They're essentially just hashing out their viewpoints. It's totally respectful the whole way. But Michael Shermer, who is founder of Skeptic Magazine and pretty big in the skeptic community, essentially had Ben, explain why he's not a Christian, right? And so, you can imagine how well that went over with Ben Shapiro's fan base in the comments. They did not like that. But I like the fact that he's willing to, talk ideas with people. Like today, speaking of what you initially called me for, like socialism and capitalism, Eric Weinstein, who he was pretty prominent in the mathematics and physics community, eventually segued over to economics and politics, and he's more of a traditional liberal, but like really knows his shit. So he was kind of making a case for, where we need more capitalism here and less regulation, but also maybe hyper socialism and these other aspects, right? He's more of a left-leaning centrist. Whereas I consider myself more of a libertarian, right-leaning centrist. But it was really good, like the conversation they had. And I like that because Ben is more of like open borders, pro-immigration kind of view and stuff, a very libertarian borders kind of view, whereas Eric was kind of defending Trump's point of views and stuff with being more hardline on immigration and why. And I thought it was really interesting, right? Because here you have like a liberal defending Trump's position versus a conservative, right? So it was really good. It was a really good conversation.
I feel like Ben has been very effective with Trump as of late.
Yeah, well, I like the fact that he's willing to talk about things he doesn't agree with. So, like, for example, like I don't always agree with his criticisms of Trump, but I like the fact that he does it, right? Because I think it's, for him and stuff, it's part of his intellectual honesty where he's like, hey, this is, these have always been my values, and my values will be that before my party, right? So even if I don't, I agree with some of his criticisms, and other ones I don't. But I like the fact that he'll voice his opinion. You're getting Ben and not just like some, I don't know, right-wing, piece. Yeah, exactly. It's authentic.
That's what I've been wondering as of late. Was like, because I guess the only one that really like struck me weird was when he posted on when Trump was being asked questions and telling the reporters to leave the room, and he was like, no, and one of the reporters was like, is Russia hacking us? He's like, no. He's not. He was like, no. And basically, like, the way I interpreted the whole video, before there had to be standards came out and clarified, the way I interpreted what he's saying is like, no, I'm not answering your questions. Like, it wasn't that he was like answering no to her questions. And then Ben jumped on it and was like, oh, Trump's saying that Russia's not doing bad and whatever. And I was like, grasping that straw is pretty hard to say that.
Yeah.
Like his off the cuff. You don't even know if he actually heard the first question or if he's saying no to that question in general. So, like, jump on that and be all damning towards Trump. But that was the thing that kind of hurt me the most. But there was a couple other things we could do, and I'm like, maybe he takes Trump and just wants to back him all the time. I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah, no, who knows, right? But I like listening to him and stuff just because even if I disagree with him, I enjoy the fact he thinks differently than I do. I try to listen to people who hold different positions than I do, right? It's why, I like listening to the socialists that'll even comment on my Facebook page and will, hear them hash it out or what their position is.
And I think that's something something that, like, you and I think most people genuinely appreciate is just intellectual honesty, right?
Yeah, no, of course.
They want people to be forward and think about it. And, like, the weird part about my channel, my little Mormon fan channel that I was doing, is, like, there have definitely been times, especially 5 years ago when I started, when I, like, didn't feel comfortable saying whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
But now, like, I'm more comfortable with my understanding, more comfortable with what I believe in saying it. But I've found that, like, in that position, it's like the ex-Mormons don't want to hear it, and the Mormons don't want to hear it, you know? It's like, like, ex-Mormons don't want any kind of positivity towards Mormonism, and the Mormons don't want any kind of questioning, at least the ones that are common. There's very few, there's very few people that are like, yeah, have questions, have doubts.
Yeah, well, the problem is they're just so dogmatic, right? I mean, like I said, it's the oak trees, right? They go from being an oak tree religiously to an oak tree non-religiously. And it's insanely frustrating to have a conversation with them because you can see, like, they're still just as stubborn as they were when they were believing. Only now it's, I'd argue, even worse because now they're, like, super convinced, right? Because that's the problem, I think, with... Because, I mean, religion to some degree has kind of always accepted the fact that, like, listen, guys, there's a part we're always going to just kind of have to rely on faith or belief without evidence to some degree, right? Like, they've kind of always accepted that, like, that just, it comes with the territory. But the problem with a lot of ex-Mormons or ex-religious people is now they're like, oh, well, see, now I'm not relying on faith anymore, so now I can go back to being, like, an even harder-ass oak tree. And that's just like, it's really difficult to have conversations with these people. And I try to point out to them and stuff where they're being religious-like, and then they just get, like, super pissed off. Because the worst thing you can do is compare an atheist to a right-wing evangelical. They hate that, even though it's true. And I'll just talk with them about it, like, when it comes to their, like, especially their economics or their politics, and it's like, listen, this is unjustified and stuff, like, socialism has failed every time it's been implemented in the way you think. What makes you think it's going to be any different, right? And I'll listen to them. I'll try to have them explain their position, but the problem is it just sounds like left-wing propaganda. If I try to get into any details with them, they don't have any good arguments. They just get pissed off, right? Similar to Blake and stuff, who was commenting on my post. It was like, can you defend your position, right? And he couldn't. Instead of trying to defend socialism, he went to attacking capitalism, right? He shifted the goalposts. Yeah. And I called him out on it because I was like, I ain't gonna put up with your bullshit. Like, you know, you're free to comment. I'm free to call you out on your bullshit, right? So, you know, it's a double-edged sword. And then he just kind of stopped commenting and stuff because he probably didn't have anything. That's the problem, is like their Marxist propaganda it's just that, it's propaganda. It's not built on anything substantial. It's all pure ideology and utopian thinking, and it's kind of scary, right? There's very little separating them from, like, say, an Islamic extremist, right? They're all doing it for some either utopia or paradise or some ethereal, unsubstantiated objective, and that kind of conviction, oppressive conviction too, is kind of scary.
Pretty damn scary.
Yeah.
So, question for you.
Yeah.
I genuinely believe that I can talk to God.
Okay.
That I can pray, receive an answer, right?
Yeah.
Like today or yesterday, I was praying about Ryan McKnight, right before I was going to have one. I prayed and asked them, should I do a video interview with him? And logically, me as the guy there, like, that would be awesome because Ryan McKnight is a fairly large name in, you know, ex-Mormon or close to being ex-Mormon circles. So if I can reach those people and help them to come to the gospel, then by golly, that would be a good thing. But again, my prayer, it was, you know, like, this probably isn't the right time. You can just talk to them, level with them, and get to understand them a little bit better, and leave it at that. And so, like, either from whatever perspective you want to approach that, like, am I just listening to my subconscious? Is the spirit really speaking to me? Am I just crazy, or like what is your opinion?
That's a good question. I don't think you're crazy. I think it's Jordan Pederson explained it best recently. So he's just a quick background. I'll get to your question. Jordan Pederson has been on tour with Sam Harris. They did 2 events in Vancouver and then an event in Dublin, Ireland, before having their 4th event in England. And I mean, like, these events are like, each one is 2 hours each, because like they, every time when they polled the audience, like, hey, do you want us to continue talking or go to Q&A, right? Like unanimous, pretty much like the majority across the board were like, please just keep continuing talking, right? So it was really interesting because you essentially had these guys hashing out their positions, being pretty much drilled and questioned back and forth one another, and very respectfully so, right? Like they're really enjoying this back and forth personally because it's helping them, you know, reach more understanding and common ground, and I like that. But Jordan Pederson, he kind of talks about some of the psychological utility of prayer, right, from a psychologist's point of view. And, you know, what that does when it comes to psychology and brain function. And Sam essentially agrees with him because, you know, Sam's a neuroscientist, so he can see this, but then he's like, well, you know, it doesn't mean like lying to oneself is justified. And so I really liked when they had Brett Weinstein on, because Brett was kind of a good mediator between the two. Same with Douglas Murray when they were in Dublin and London. And they were able to bridge the gap successfully, I think, between both of them, where Brett, being an evolutionary biologist, was like, listen, I can see the utility about what Jordan is talking about, while also seeing the fact that Sam thinks we should maintain, you know, a commitment to truth. But I'm also talking about how, you know, we really think in these terms, and that's important to understand, right? I mean, people, for example, we remember things best and we think things best in terms of stories, right? That's how we think. We think and we remember best when we hear information told in a story. And that's how we operate. It's how our brains work psychologically. We're much better. That's one of the tricks that guys and stuff, when they go to like these memory competitions where they have to memorize different shit, is that universally across the best ones, they talk about how their different techniques they use essentially comes to building a story in their mind. And that's like, I think that's incredible, because it shows how powerful story is when it comes to understanding and communicating information. And so in that and stuff, like I said, I think Jordan Pederson is correct in a lot of ways, and so is Sam, but I agree with Brett in that, you know, we should try to work with our biology instead of against it, is kind of my point of view. So no, I don't think you're crazy. I think it's a lot of it is evolutionary based, right? And this is kind of where Jordan Pederson gets to talking about like metagod, for example, right? And the Greeks were kind of the first ones to point this out, right? They went to India and they were like, you know, these Indians, they have different gods, different cultures, different rituals, different beliefs. But they realized, well, what do they have in common? Well, they still have gods, they still have rituals, they still have beliefs, right? So it's like, you know, there's this commonality and stuff that you see behind all of these religions, which, you know, I like to talk about in terms of meta-religion or meta-god, right? What do these things have in common and stuff, and what is their utility? And so I think that's kind of how I like to look at it, rather than just like, oh, they're dumb, right? I think that's so intellectually dumb, ironically enough.
Well, and that's like, I guess that's kind of where I feel stuck, because not only do I feel like I can access the divine through prayer, and I feel that the answers that I receive are beyond my physical comprehension, whether that's me tapping into my subconscious, that is, you know, my full brain power working that I just don't know how to actually consciously, whatever.
Subconscious is crazy powerful.
Yeah. And so I still choose to believe that is God. And believe essentially the tenets of Mormonism, or it's not only the fact that Mormonism teaches me how to access that power and harness that power to the fullest degree, to the greatest potential. And I don't know, as of yet, another medium at which that's attained. But I think that, I feel like that's why a lot of people do yoga or do other things, because they feel a close connection to whatever that is.
No, of course, right? It brings a sense of, peace and stability in people's lives, right? And that's the thing is it's like that peace and serenity and kind of connectedness to something bigger than yourself. Like pretty much all religions have that to some degree, right? And I think that's, again, an important commonality that Jordan Pederson or, these evolutionary psychologists will even talk about, right? It's like, that's powerful, and we shouldn't trivialize, how powerful that is, right? And so, in some degree, when you say, you're communicating with God, to some degree, I agree with you, because like how Jordan Pederson puts it, he says, relates God as being the idea of the abstract ideal, right? So you're trying to communicate with this ideal so that you can better align yourself with this ideal, right? I mean, effectively, that's what a lot of people are trying to do with their gods. It's like, this is the ideal, and I'm trying to align myself with this ideal. And so,
what would the best possible being ever created do?
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, what's crazy is Sam Harris plays the same kind of abstraction game when with his secular morality, right? And Ben Shapiro even talks about, Sam and I essentially have the same values in a lot of ways. We just derive them differently. And so it was interesting, though, in that Sam kind of plays an abstraction game as well to some degree. I mean, he's aware it is, but he still tries to scrape out the utility, because Sam Harrison is somebody who recognizes the utility and a lot of the good in religion and is trying to sift the wheat from the tares, if you will, and not throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to getting to the meat and potatoes of what religion is all about. And what Jordan Pederson is saying is Sam, you're right, these are the most important things, but how do you communicate that? How do you get that to transcend lifetimes, right, without the power of myth and story and archetypes? And I think Jordan Pederson makes a good case there, where it's Sam is spot on when it comes to his morality and what he wants, and Ben Shapiro agrees with him, and Jordan Pederson agrees with him. But I think the hard part is, though, is how do you communicate that for generations to come? And I think that's kind of difficult without the power of myth and story.
Well, that's kind of what I imagine, and I don't know this, but if there ever was maybe the Council of Nicaea, or not if there ever was Council of Nicaea, but maybe the Council of Nicaea, or maybe the Apostles of the LDS Church, or maybe some of the popes of the Vatican, maybe 500 years ago, in some upper room somewhere of people that were deciding the fate of the Catholic religion, maybe Sam Harris and Joe Rogan and Jordan Pederson, those type of minds were all sitting there debating. And, they each, one of them wanted to pull the rug out. So, Martin Luther would be like, "Oh, this is all false. No, maintain it because it's going to create more stability, keep stability in people." And another one is "Well, we need to help people, inspire people to live better lives." I just have to imagine, and I could be wrong, but I have to imagine for the most part, if there are people in religion that found that religion wasn't a lie, that the reason why they maintained the lie was for the general public good.
Yes. Well, you're spot on. Jordan Pederson actually made that point and stuff, where if somebody's kind of dumb, and he says dumb and stuff, or ignorant, but then he says how that all applies to like people who are even quote unquote smart or other people, how they should be conservative, right? Because if you're not able to really think these things through deeply, then it helps to essentially just have your morality, your ethics, your stories kind of just handed to you, right? Like, here you go, right? Like, you don't have to. It was very hard for the layperson back in the day when he's like, I gotta make some food to buy, enough shekels or some shit for my family to survive, right? Is they didn't really have the luxury to just sit around all day philosophizing or to really engage in deep conversation. Yeah, exactly, right? That wasn't a luxury afforded to most people. And so, I think in a lot of ways we kind of take for granted that. And so, and I think that's kind of the case for many people, right? It's like still today where you have a lot of people, I don't think they really sit down and think about these things. But I'd also argue they just kind of care about dumb shit, right? Like, I mean, I could, right? Yeah, it's like rather than caring about, philosophy or meaning or anything like that, it's like, well, what are the Kardashians doing today? I'm like, Jesus Christ, right? It's like, it's like, oh, God.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah, right? The way, the truth, the life. Yeah, and so I think it's, it might be something to that where they saw it's like, oh, this is useful to essentially convey an ethic. Because all Christianity really was kind of a Jewish mystery faith combined with contemporary Greek philosophy, right? I mean, that's where they got the Logos and a bunch of other stuff from, was the Stoics, which was a very, prominent Greek philosophy at that time. And then like Bar Airman talks about, I mean, Jesus was essentially, made to be some kind of Zeus-like figure, right? It's why they made him look like all the other Greek gods. They didn't make him look like a Galilean Semite, brown skin, short, curly Jewish hair, which was common for that time, is they gave him, white Aryan skin and flowing beards and blue eyes, right? Because, men create gods in their own image. And he also talks about the way, too, in that Jesus is a demigod in all the three ways that you can be a demigod in the ancient Greek religion. He had, mortal mother and eternal father, check. Immaculate conception, check, and also earning it, check, right? And essentially earning and godhood. So all the three ways that you could become a god in classical Greek religion, he did that. And Bart Ehrman also brings up like other examples through that as well, like how for Constantine really just kind of played the religious syncretism game. In that, he personally considered Jesus to be just the mortal incarnation of the state god, Sol Invictus, which is Latin for unconquerable sun, their sun god who was on their coinage at the time. And because that was a big deal. If the god is on your coinage and stuff, like that's a god you believe in. So a lot of historians and stuff, the fact that Constantine was also Christian with this is for him, it was probably, there was really no either or. It was just like, oh, this is just the avatar or mortal incarnation of Sol Invictus. Yeah, that's fine, right? And so you get this religious syncretism game that's being played. It's really fascinating when he goes into it. But to be fair, that's kind of a game that's always been played, right? This is where I love studying religious scholarship. It's a great book I recommend reading. You could just find it for free online in Google Books, but it's peer-reviewed scholarship by Mark Smith, who is this Old Testament scholar, and it's called The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, but it dives into the polytheistic roots of Judaism and how, from a historical standpoint, it's really hard to differentiate an Israelite from a Canaanite, and how their gods consolidated, and how like Ben even admitted on his show, which was pretty cool, on how, the whole heaven-hell concept isn't a Jewish concept. It's not found anywhere in the canonical Old Testament at all, right? Jews believe they went to one place called Sheol. Everybody went there, right? Or, you kind of either cease to exist. There was a lot of ambiguity about what Sheol was. But after Babylonian captivity, when they were conquered by the Persians, you got this different tune being sung, right? Which is why we know that Isaiah had two authors, first and second Isaiah, because after the Babylonian captivity, things start to change. The narrative starts to shift to some degree, because in the religion of the Persians at the time was Zoroastrianism. And in Zoroastrianism was the precursor to all monotheism. It was the closest thing to monotheism before Judaism decided to essentially mold itself after the religion of its captors. So in Zoroastrianism, there's two gods, the Ahura Mazda and then the bad god. I forget his name. But if you follow Ahura Mazda and listen to his commands, right, you go to heaven. And if you follow the other god, you go to this hell, right? Sound familiar? And that concept wasn't in Judaism, right? Like Lucifer was just some angel. He wasn't a bad guy until post-Babylonian captivity, right? When they start to kind of like play with their scriptures, like, oh, you know, maybe we can shift this here a bit, right? You start to see this religious syncretism where, you know, the religion of their captors starts to become more mirrored, right? And it even says too, I think, I know it does, I can't remember where though exactly, in the Old Testament, on how Cyrus, who was, you know, one of the Babylonian leaders at that time, you know, was chill with God, right? Because it's like, oh, it's pretty similar to our religion. It's like, well, yeah, we ripped off our religion from their religion. I just find that stuff fascinating, right? Like, I think it's so fascinating because the God of Abraham is very different than Moses' God or in the God of the later chapters in the Old Testament. Because in Moses's, Abraham's God was El, and El was the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. So the Canaanites gods, there was a bunch of them. They had El, they had Baal, they had El's wife, Asherah, and then a whole slew of like other gods and stuff, which was pretty common for this Semitic region. I mean, El's contemporary gods in that time period for Greece, for example, was Kronos. And then what happened is you had Yahweh. Now, Yahweh was not originally a Canaanite god. The oldest records we can find of Yahweh and stuff is Yahweh of the Shashu. And the Shashu were nomadic peoples, which makes sense because what became Israel essentially was made up of disenfranchised Canaanites. So Canaanites in the lower economic and social status sphere, made up of former slaves and made up of nomads. So it makes sense and stuff that they would get these gods, and then they eventually started to consolidate their gods, which we have 4 different versions of the Old Testament, like the priestly text, the Yahweh's text, so on and so forth, right? And you get these, and you see this playing out and stuff. Anyways, like, I could go into this for too long because I find it fascinating and I study it a lot. But
yeah, I'm enjoying this. I don't feel like you're rambling or anything like that. I'm enjoying it.
No, you're okay. Good. I just like for me and stuff. I get really passionate about this stuff, like biblical scholarship and just ancient religions and what people believed in general. And I just find it fascinating. So it's really cool when you start to see this syncretism and how these things played out throughout history. And it's cool to me, like, how well documented it all is. And when we got the Ugarit, which the Ugarit is an extinct Semitic language, but we were able to translate it and stuff thanks to these findings in France in like the 1920s. And what they did is they gave us a lot of insight to the pre-biblical literature and what it was talking about. And, it's just rich with polytheism, right? Like throughout, you have these polytheistic gods and stuff that Israel and their neighboring nations all believed in, and how deeply polytheistic Israel was. Because if you go into the Ugaritic text with, for example, Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, it's really interesting because you have how Yahweh is a second-tier storm god compared to El. And El essentially is the one divvying out the portions of land and who gets what. It was only later that they became synonymous with one another, and that Yahweh became an epithet, which is, like a title, one of El's titles, and El became a generic term for a god, right? But like I said, they essentially just consolidated their gods, right? Like, so all of El's titles became Yahweh's titles, right? So El Shaddai, El Elyon, all of that. So yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's also too why you get two different versions of the creation story in Genesis, right? Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 is actually the more recent account, and Genesis 2 is the older account. And you can see too, right? I mean, the creation order is entirely different, and the narratives are just different. And you can go into the Enuma Elish, which is pre-biblical literature that we still have, and see where a lot of these things kind of match up, right? And where it sounds like a lot of other Semitic religions at that time that even Jordan Pederson also likes to talk about, like with Tiamat, the dragon, and all of that fun stuff. But yeah, no, I think it's fascinating.
Is there any way in your mind that kind of like how Mormonism has the authority to evolve by virtue of revelation? Is there any substance to that in your mind that as these people began to come closer to God, that they, I guess, evolved in their spirituality and were able to kind of attain more light understanding as time went on?
It's a good question. How I kind of look at, I have to go what I see evidence for, right? So I look at this and I see that it doesn't look much different than what other religions in other areas are doing, right? So that's the thing. If I'm using one measuring stick, I have to use it fairly, right? So I have to apply it to the other religions as well. But I look at it and I see that the most ancient, oldest religions are all polytheistic. I mean, Hinduism is the oldest religion still in practice. And it's really fascinating how Hinduism works and how all of these other gods and whatnot work. I don't really see evidence, though, for necessarily it being anything other than man-made progression of religion, which all the other areas were essentially doing at the time to some degree simultaneously. All right, as you see this kind of progression in religion, and it's hard to view it as, well, if there is supposed to be one correct way and stuff, then, well, for one, the timeline is all skewed, right? The timeline is very different than the timeline you get in the Bible, and also too, like, it's really messy how it gets, and also too, I mean, like, the patriarchs, whether Abraham or whatnot, he was not a monotheist, right? He was probably a henotheist at best, where he had his god he worshipped, El, but, acknowledged the fact that the other gods also existed. Like, staunch monotheism really didn't come into practice until later, like close to around the development of Christianity. But even then, like I said, the Romans were kind of doing it to some degree, where they had their one state god, Sol Invictus, and were already kind of going along that lines of unification, because it was easier to unite people under a core common belief. And if you look at this, so I mean, that's just kind of how religions had always been. Like the oldest religions, you kind of have a god for everything. And then the gods started to get jurisdictions, right? So then you have like Yahweh being a storm god, Zeus and Thor being storm gods. You have Poseidon, his jurisdiction was the sea and hurricanes. And then, they all had their pantheon gods, the god who was at the top kind of leading the hierarchy. So, El for the Semitic peoples and Zeus for the others and Odin and whatnot. So to me, it looks like religion. It looks like all of them and stuff have these things in common. So to be able to say just anyone is superior, better to another. I just don't think we have evidence for that personally.
Could they essentially merge into one? Like, could they be, like, in my opinion,
Well,
I don't think that
the Hindus did that, but yeah.
I don't think we have, like, your religion. Like, I don't think it's here. Like, I think that I kind of feel that every person and every religion has been striving to reach every aspect.
178.
Science is helping us get there. Science and whatever religion is, like, eventually that will just be proof, nothing else.
Okay.
I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like, he was pretty convinced, like, random night with, like, being there today, you know? And I was like, well, like, sure, that might be something that's been taught in Mormonism, but I don't think that that's, like, even a core tenet that you must believe in order to, you know, obtain godhood or whatever it might be. I feel like a lot of the things that a lot of atheists propose, the ways of, like, being a moral person, being a good person, and helping others, are going to go a lot further than the specific belief that Joseph Smith is going to be judging a lot. You know, it's like, I think that's kind of the point of Mormonism. If that was a core tenet of your belief, then I understand why you lost that faith. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I get that.
But yeah, I don't know. I just feel like truth is what you're seeking, and it's noble. And I feel like there's got to be more though than just what we see and is explainable. I don't know.
No, right? Like it's hard, right? And I get that, right? Like that's fair. And I don't knock people for thinking that way or for feeling that way, right? Like what I'm trying to do is let reality tell me how it is instead of how I think it should be, right? Because I think I can't remember. I think it was Christopher Hitchens says the universe doesn't give a damn what you think about it, right? You know, it is as it is and stuff, despite how we think it ought to be, right? I think that can be a really hard pill for people to swallow to some degree, right? Because it can be really intimidating, and I get that, right? Like, I mean, shit, from a Cosmo perspective, right? Like, calling us a speck is insulting to specks. You know, it's you know, I mean, our pale blue dot is within, you know, it's only a fraction the size of the sun, and then there's billions of suns within our galaxy, and then billions of galaxies within our universe. It's like, Jesus, right? Like, I mean, you know, if you want to really feel humble, right? Like, yeah, you just kind of adopt a cosmic perspective for a few minutes. It's like, wow, oh, that's incredible.
That's actually, like, one of my theories internally. Well, I guess that's how I'm feeling, but that's one of my theories of why coastal cities and cities in general are more atheist, because they can't see the stars and they don't have enough time to reflect on the minuteness of how small we really are.
Yeah, no, we're tiny. We're so tiny.
I feel like when people see the stars, that it kind of pulls you out of your own head and makes you realize that there's got to be more.
Yeah, and I think there is more. I think we're ever on this edge and stuff between the known and the unknown, right? What we know and what there's left to know. And I think that journey is fascinating. So for me, I take a methodological naturalistic approach to reality because I think that's what has yielded the most results. And methodological naturalism, for simplicity's sake, you could just think of as like the scientific method, right? Like that's essentially what the scientific method does is it's like, okay, this is the observable universe and what we can discover, and like, let's try to figure it out, right? And I think that's important to acknowledge, right? And so, because I've been defending, you know, religion and its utility a lot, but to also, to Sam's point, I mean, he's got a point, right? I mean, you have religions and stuff who make claims about the origin of the universe that according to the holy books without taking in some kind of poetic approach to it. I mean, they're factually incredibly wrong. That's not how any of this happens. I mean, you have days before the sun's created, and then you have the creation of animals, even from if you were to even grant, okay, like when they're introducing birds versus other things, like Jesus, from an evolutionary point of view, like this is all skewed, right? Like it doesn't match up to anything that we know about factual reality. And then where Jordan Pederson would come in and say, well, yeah, duh, people back then didn't think in those terms, right? They thought in terms of the universe wasn't made up of matter, it was what matters, right? So it was like if you look at a rock, for example, like they didn't just see a rock. They saw a tool, they saw a hammer, they saw something you could grind up nuts and break stuff open with. They saw a weapon, right? So they saw meaning in objects before they saw what the object itself was, a rock, right? Like those categorizations came later, which is why, from an evolutionary point of view, we tend to think in terms of stories and meaning, and why we're more than willing to assign meaning to what are probably just coincidences or trivial events, right? Because that's what we do as people. There was a satire I was listening to that about the other day on how like this girl was like, I'm fucking my hot married boss and whatnot, and I was starting to feel like really uncomfortable about it. But then in yoga class, this girl on her pants had the words that said just chill, and I was like, oh, you know what? I should just chill, right? Like there's a sign from the universe I was ignoring to like, you know what, girl, relax, it'll work itself out. And so, it's kind of funny and stuff in that, like, okay, she's deriving meaning from what is all but really just kind of a pointless and meaningless coincidence. But the satire was the point of like, well, religious people do that all the time. But to be fair, so do non-religious people, right? I mean, we kind of subscribe meaning to what is probably just coincidence. I mean, how we have more events in our life that are meaningless versus those we don't, right? It's why as people we think in terms of confirmation bias. We all do it. Hell, I do it all the time, right? We look for evidence that supports our position while ignoring contrary claims, right? Like whether it's like a missionary, like, oh my God, we were knocking doors all day and we prayed and we got in, and this person, they listened to our lesson, right? All while ignoring the fact that the Jehovah's Witnesses are having similar experiences and, that they feel just as convicted about. Same with, missionaries of other faiths or different religions, or, the Muslim the guy who finally decided to submit to Allah and become a Muslim, right? Like we ignore the fact that these events happen all the time in contrary ways to how we look at the narrative, right? So that's something I got to try to account for if I want to be intellectually honest. So it's messy.
Yeah, and the way that I account for that, I don't know if this satisfies it, but I feel that God allows, or from what I understand about God will allow anyone to come closer to Him. And while each of those religions might not have the truth, they each have truth that will bring people closer to Him. And I feel that He allows people to receive the amount of truth that they're willing to receive. If that makes sense. So, like,
no, for sure.
In my opinion, might not be the way, but we got a lot of stuff in there. We might have mixed it in with some of the other stuff. Like basically the way I see it is like there was a Seventh-day Adventist was a friend, a Facebook friend that he does virtual reality stuff and stuff. He was commenting on like, are there any good Seventh-day Adventist podcasts out there? So I started talking to him. He was effectively trying to create a recovering from Seventh-day Adventist podcast, similar to my Mormonism one, but a little bit different, right? And
yeah.
He was brought up in the way that Seventh-day Adventists or the only true stuff. And the way that I explained it to him is the way I understand it. It's like, you know, I see it as there are laws you help your fellow man that's less attached to it, or whatever it may be. And so, but there's also a bunch of other crap that doesn't have any blessings attached to it because it was invented by man. And so people in whatever religion can feel the blessings and feel the guidance from God because they're adhering to a certain law, no matter what religion they're in, because God doesn't respect, he's not a respecter of persons, meaning like if you're an atheist and you decide to rest one day a week, you know, you decide to not work on a Tuesday and you decide to make that day your day of meditation, day of rest, like it might be, you might not attribute to God, but God is still going to bless you, or you're still going to be blessed because it's a law. So, in my opinion, like all the different religions are all trying to find out what those laws are, and while some of them have, you know, also uploaded 100 versions of the Go Explode Yourself, which wasn't one of the laws, but because someone bought into the 7th day of rest, or because they bought into the prayer and meditation, they thought that meant everything else about that religion was also true, when it really isn't. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, for sure, right. And I like I said, I'm sympathetic towards that perspective. But my point is, like, other religions feel the exact same way you do about your religion, just about everybody else, right? Where it's like, okay, everybody has some.
Most people don't. Most people say that I'm just wrong.
Oh, you'd be surprised. Like Hinduism, for example, I think probably has the most, probably universal kind of structure to their religion. Because in Hinduism, I mean, it can get kind of confusing if you're unfamiliar with it, because people think that Hinduism is polytheistic, right? Like, you know, there's like over 300 million gods, a lot of freaking gods, right? Like, well, that's false. Hinduism is actually monotheistic, and people get surprised about that. Because in Hinduism, there is Brahman. And, well, again, depends on your version of Hinduism, but for the sake of explanation and for kind of talking about the ones that appear to be polytheistic, there's Brahman, and Brahman is synonymous with ultimate reality. Brahman is everything, and everything is Brahman. Brahman is kind of the isness of reality. And then within Brahman, you have their Trinity, right? So underneath that, you have the top manifestations of Brahman, which is like Brahma, the creator, and then Vishnu,
like their Jesus,
the preserver, yeah, and then Shiva, the destroyer. And so you have this OG Trinity and stuff of gods. And then under them and stuff, you have also like a bunch of other, you know, I don't want to just say lower gods, but more specific gods as well, like Hanuman or Ganesha or Krishna and stuff, which are all just kind of different manifestations. So in Hinduism, you essentially can have your god, right? So for the example's sake, let's say my god is Ganesha and yours is Hanuman. The fact that you and I have different gods that we pray to and try to emulate is not inconsistent or paradoxical. It's just whatever manifestation of Brahman that works or that, you know, has the most utility for you. So for me, it's Ganesha, and for you, it's Hanuman. But it's not that I'm wrong or you're wrong. It's that that's just whichever manifestation that you're choosing to emulate in your life, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I can kind of go along with that. Here's why I can kind of go along with it. Because I realize that, like, you understand the point of view that I have, because you have the one.
Mm-hmm. I've been a lot of things, but yeah.
So I can't, like, say from an outside point of view, but I can realize from, like, an outside point of view or from an atheist point of view where it's, like, it would feel like I'm trying to mold the world around my point of view, right?
Yeah.
And, but from my point of view, I don't see that I'm trying to do that, right? Like it's probably a natural byproduct because I'm working with what I have, what I understand, and what I've seen in the world, right? And what I've seen in the world of current is that there's been a lot of miracles and a lot of really special things that have happened to me within the confines of Mormonism. That's the way that I've understood and explained it. So that's the way I'll continue to explain it until I find a better explanation. And when I was on the mission, I remember there was a lady who was like a pillar of her Catholic community, and she let us in, taught her regularly, and we went and helped her with stupid stuff, and she was agreeing to read the Book of Mormon and whatever else. And I remember praying and asking God, like, why she wasn't receiving answers to become a Mormon, more or less. And the answer that I received in prayer was that she was going to do more good as a Catholic to bring people closer to God than she would as a Mormon. And that seemed, pretty unlike the God or doctrine that I knew within Mormonism. But it seemed somewhat in line with Hinduism, or what you're saying. It's like effectively that there's different ways people resonate with God.
Yeah.
In a way.
No, for sure. Yeah.
But I don't know if I completed that thought, but would that mean like, does that even make sense with your view of what God is and how He could answer prayers? Like, I don't know. It kind of surprised me, but.
Well, like I said, for me, when I was religious, I took a Mormon Hindu approach to religion, right? So for me, like, when I had started to study like the Old Testament and all of these polytheistic gods and the polytheistic roots of Judaism and how like all of these other things were, it's like, oh, see, like, yeah, that makes sense, right? Because then for me, it was like, well, in Mormonism, like they already believe in Elohim, which is essentially one of El's titles as well. And it's also the word used in the creation stories of Genesis. It's a plural term, but nonetheless, it applied to the Canaanite god El before any other god. And then, in Mormonism too, it's like, well, they believe God has a wife. It's like, oh, that's just Asherah, right? Like that's what we see in the Canaanite polytheism he was married to. And then, Yahweh gets lumped with Jesus. But even without that, it's like, okay. And then, they already believe in Lord's many and God's many. So it's like, okay, that makes sense. And so, for me and stuff, it was just like, well, I don't see how, for example, like, other gods couldn't coexist since that's already something that Mormons kind of subscribe to. And like in Mormon theology, Mormon God is not all powerful in the same way that abstract God for probably contemporary Christianity is. But that's normal because he's not that way in the Bible in a lot of ways, right? It's a very human God who wrestles with Jacob and breaks his hip and, shit like that. And so it wasn't just like this ethereal force like from Star Wars. But it was, and so it's, yeah, but then for me and stuff, but I then also was reconciling the fact, well, it's like, but then how do you explain either the infinite regress that you get in Mormonism or the fact that, there's a higher standard that Mormon God appeals to, right? Because Mormon God is bound by things outside of himself, or else, he kind of has to turn in God card and, hey man, you can't play this game anymore. And so, so it's like, okay, there's something out there stronger than Mormon Elohim and stuff. And so it's like, okay, he's clearly not the lawgiver, the lawmaker. He's just kind of law messenger boy at best. And so
I've never gotten that. Well, maybe the laws are eternal and that he doesn't have the power to break them.
Yeah. Well, exactly. They're outside of him, right? So they precede him.
But not that he never made them.
Well, that's the thing, right? They just are, right? Like, how do you? And then there was just one day, this infinite regress of gods and man, right? It just logically it doesn't make a lot of sense. So for me, it was like, okay, but Brahmin made a lot more sense, right? It's kind of like, oh, well, Hinduism's the oldest religion, and Hinduism reconciles their Zeus-like figure gods, which is kind of what Mormonism has too, with the fact that it's all nested inside of Brahman. So for me, that just made a lot of sense, is that, Brahman transcends everything. Because Brahman is everything, right? It resonates through everything. It is more akin to that force in Star Wars, but also, but that makes sense in the fact that it's nesting inside itself transcendent laws and stuff that even, other gods had to be bound to. So for me and stuff, that's kind of how I used to look at it and reconcile the two and stuff.
So I have an experience that I want you to think about. Well, I've got two that I'm curious about. These are, and I share them with you. I've shared them with other people. I might have shared them with you before. But I feel like I'm not catching pearls before it's flying. That old mantra, but there was, I'll probably tell you this again. My memory isn't always the best, but there was a time, like, I don't even know, like 5 years ago probably. And I think it was when I first tried driving Lyft, and so it was like 2 in the morning when I was done and I was driving back on the freeway. And I think I was already, like, I was already on the phone because I was supposed to come earlier, like that. And I remember seeing a guy on the side of the freeway, and I was thinking to myself, like, who is this idiot? And then I felt what I would deem as the spirit say, pick him up. And I, like, wrestled with the spirit, and no, I'm not, like, I'm already late, I'm in trouble, and I felt it again, like, very firmly, like, go pick him up. So I, like, relented. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I was like, okay, fine. Because I know that fallen spirit is going to be, like, the best possible situation for me or for the guy. I'm going to fall spirit into this. And I went to pick him up, and he was totally drunk off the rocker. And he was on, like, 45 minutes out, and I asked him where he was going. He was going, like, down past Vancouver. And I was just like, holy crap, this guy's gonna die. Like, he's gonna have to walk across multiple on-ramps, and he would have, like, died. So, alright, get in the car, let's go. And so we start going down, and as I'm going down to the Vancouver Highway off-ramp, I see a car that has its first lights on, and I was like, well, guess I'm already doing the Lord's work. Might as well stop and get this guy some help. Hey, you doing okay? And he's like, yeah, I'm trying to find this house. Sent me the address. And I grew up in Draper. I knew where this was, where he dropped off. I said, okay, yeah, let me take this guy home, and then I'll take you there. Follow me. So dropped off this guy, and like the next street to the left, went to this house where the guy was trying to go. I could tell that he was kind of in distress, so I was like, is everything okay? Like, I don't know my friend. We were at this party. Left with his friend, but like no one knew like what was happening and stuff. So I decided to like go in there, and I felt depressed. Going with him, we went around like back to the house. We opened the sliding glass door. This dude, like, the shirt off, comes to the door, and like, what are you doing here? And like, they were about to fight. And then I like kind of stepped in the light. Not that I was, not that I'm like a formidable force to reckon with, but just that there were two of us kind of stepped down from an aggressive stand, and the guy who I went there with, like, asked where the girl was. She was like, oh, she's not here. I don't know what you're talking about. And we hear, like, in the background, like, help, over here. And so he, like, goes and, like, picks the girl up. She's, like, hidden in her bra underwear, like, in, like, a weird state, and picks her up, took her up in the car. Like, that was it. And, like, for me, I'm sitting there, like, how in the world do I write that off I'm sure that there's many people in the world that would love that agnosticism, but where I'm directly feeling a prompting of what I consider God, and I am trying with all my might not listen, right? I'm like, I don't want to go help you, like, how do you get home? But I lament and I listen to God, and I effectively help save someone from being raped. Like, how do I ever deny that God is there?
Yeah, man. No, it's sounds like a really powerful personal experience. And like I said, I don't deny those, and I also don't try to trivialize them for people, right? Like, I get that, because I've had similar things, whether it was like with Jesus or Krishna, right? Like, and that's not to like try to trivialize it by bringing in multiple things. It's just like I felt just as convicted of like what I was thinking and feeling, right? And so, like I said, I don't deny that people have experiences. I also don't deny that people have experiences that are life-changing or that are profound to them, right? And again, that's a kind of a good example where, we think in terms of story and we tell things in terms of story, because stories are powerful, man. Like, I don't trivialize the power of story. For me, though, for personally, when I've had, similar and very, very powerful, what I consider experiences, both kind of whether it's like Hindu visions or, very religious experiences more akin to what you described, it's like, okay, like how do I reconcile that? Well, it's like, okay, well, I got to think about it. One, I live in a culture and stuff where that's become acceptable, right? I see my beliefs kind of manifesting in that, right? It's kind of like there's this person and stuff who recorded like near-death experiences that people had, and if you listen to them, like depending geographically speaking what a person was familiar with, their highest ideal is kind of what manifests to them, right? Whether it was Jesus or Krishna, or there was one girl and stuff, she was a little kid, and guess who she saw? She saw Santa Claus. And so, like, that's who she saw in her near-death experience, was Santa Claus, because for her, that was her highest good manifestation at that time. So it makes sense with kind of how the brain operates. And when Sam Harris, for example, he talks about the brain, so split brain phenomena. I don't know if you're too familiar with it, but if you essentially sever the corpus callosum, which divides the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, you effectively create two people in one body. So you have the left hemisphere can no longer hear what the right hemisphere thinks, and vice versa. And it's really interesting, like how listening to the stories and stuff now of how people interact or how they behave, right? So you've effectively put two people who now share one body. And it's fascinating how that erupts or how that develops. And just how powerful that is. I mean, and so his point too is like, to some degree, when we have this corpus callosum attached, these kind of multiple voices, multiple speakers is going on all the time to some degree. And I find that fascinating, right? It kind of ties into the fact, like he kind of talks about, you can't think your thoughts before you think them, right? They just kind of spontaneously appear in consciousness. You didn't offer those, right? And so this kind of ties into his points on kind of a lack of libertarian free will, and that you can choose to do what you want to do, but you can't choose what it is that you want to do. And he kind of goes into that and stuff and makes a really essentially solid case for it. But my point is that like we have what appears to be an orchestra of voices and speakers and whatnot all in our head and stuff, and that our personalities that we get appear to be, how he would use the term illusion, but I prefer how Sean Carroll describes it, and he's a physicist, as emergent property, on how our sense of self tends to be an emergent property when you have enough brain chemistry and neurons going on that you develop what appears to be a sense of self, more akin to like, okay, when does water start to become wet, right? That's the question he poses. How many water molecules do you need to assemble before you get the emergent property of wetness, right? It kind of starts to emerge after a certain point. And we see these in other things within physics. And so for me, I just find this fascinating. So how I tend to think about those things is you have your ideal self, the idea of the abstract ideal, that through years and years of religious worship and whatnot has kind of cemented into your consciousness, right? Or your subconsciousness. So your idea of your abstract ideal that you're subconsciously trying to align yourself with because you very much value it will kind of give you course corrections from then on, right? Is that people tend to follow their values, right? I'm that way a lot of the time, right? Sometimes I have what appears to be conflicts of what I want to do versus my values. And I kind of have a similar internal conscious kind of battle. And I used to have this when I was like a believing Hindu and with other things. And now and stuff, I think I have a more, I guess, scientific understanding of kind of how some of that stuff starts to develop. Obviously, there's still a lot of mystery, and I'm not claiming by any means that we've solved consciousness, but I do think there are other variables and other factors that, probably still need to be discovered. But the fact that story and our idea of our abstract ideal, the collective unconsciousness and whatnot, like Carl Jung and Jordan Pederson have talked about, I think that's powerful, and I'm not quick to write that off. So when you tell me and stuff like, you get these promptings from God, in some ways I agree with you, because I think the idea of your abstract ideal has cemented itself in your subconsciousness to probe you whenever you're out of line with that. I just also think there happens to be a naturalistic explanation to it.
Sure. One more question.
Yeah.
So when you talk about visions that you have, like, I've had a near-death experience. I didn't see God, but I guess it was more like out-of-body experience where I saw my body laying there. There was that. That's more of like a memory. But then there was another time when I had like a vision, like basically struggling with my testimony more or less, and I decided to pull the state president and one of the counselors over after the sacrament meeting, and I was like, hey, this whole baptized typically parents thing doesn't drive me. And it hadn't drive for a long time. I didn't agree with it. And then they started to kind of give me some stereotypical stake president stuff, what you'd expect a stake president or a mixed president to say. And,
yeah, I'm following.
I was just kind of rolling my eyes like, yeah, I get what you have to say, but like, gel with me here, work with me here, let's talk about it. And when the stake president said the words, like, we believe that the president of the Church is a prophet, the past, present, and future, like, it was almost as if future was like the key word that opened up this window of, like, starting above his head and filled the room where I was effectively pulled to the steps of the Supreme Court, and I could understand very, like, vividly everything, like, the emotion in the air and, like, the context around what was happening, and I could just feel everything about the situation, and, like, everything about it felt very real. And what I understood was that because the church, the Mormon church, was teaching kids that being gay was a sin, it had negative effects on a gay family who, like, effectively they brought the court case and it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the verdict of it was altering religious freedom in America. And so then I understood that the reason why, and whether, I don't know, whether it was that was what the prophet also saw, or whether it was the illustration that that the prophets have access to more information than I might know regarding church politics. It satisfied my mind that the policy was okay because effectively the greater good, it was effectively cutting off Laban's head, where some people, Laban, the children of gay parents, might suffer in the short term, but in the long term, more people would be able to have religious freedom. I don't know. How would you reconcile that with something? And the reason why I say those is because those are specific instances where I personally didn't want it to happen. I personally didn't feel like I wanted it. And again, you say that it was the subconscious ideal, but where does that vision come from? Why do I get teleported to this step of the Supreme Court and see something that I've never thought before and feel and see as if I'm really there?
It's a good question. Yeah. And to be honest, I don't know, right? I don't have all the answers to how consciousness works and whatnot. And there's still a lot I got to figure out, right? And I've had similar experiences and stuff where, for me and stuff, things have kind of clicked. I've gotten in what would be described as, aha moments, or it just almost what seems like a burst of enlightenment all at once. Wow, okay, I get it, right? Just kind of these big kind of profound clicking moments, or, what at the time too I previously would describe as visions with different things and whatnot, stuff like that. And it was just these kind of deeper intuitive understandings that kind of cemented it on myself, right? And so for me, how I just, like I said, how I look at it is just I think consciousness is much more mysterious than we're willing to give it credit for. But like I said, given all the background actors and stuff that we have in our heads, it's kind of fascinating. So you mentioned experiences and stuff that you're hesitant, to cast pearls before swine, and rightfully so. But I've also, Sam Harris and Jordan Pederson have been talking about kind of the utility of psychedelics that started to intrigue me. 82% of people who take magic mushrooms and have what is called, a quote-unquote spiritual experience, quit smoking forever, right? That's pretty incredible. And they've also used these to successfully treat people who, are suffering with anxiety or depression, and also people and stuff who are dying. And it's just incredible what they're able to do with these. And what we're learning too from an anthropological point of view is that, things like shrooms and stuff and these natural psychedelics played a huge influence on our culture and possibly even our evolution. Some people hypothesize, and it's not a hypothesis we're able to test and whatnot, but it's interesting nonetheless, not as well substantiated as the cultural, on knowing how big these things were in culture, but the hypothesis that, things like mushrooms could have even played a role in our evolution of our consciousness and becoming more human. And so I find that fascinating. And so I wanted to, because after having previously had spiritual experiences and other things, really kind of see what it was, they're talking about. Because a lot of religions throughout the past also use some kind of substance and stuff to generate experience. And the problem is too, substances get really a bad rap in our culture. I mean, libertarians kind of are doing some to fix it in that, hey, what is legal and illegal does not make something moral or immoral. Slavery used to be legal, right? They make good arguments there. And also too, with substances, not all substances are equal, right? I mean, cocaine and marijuana I would not put in the same category, right? In the same way that we would not put a bag of Doritos and a bag of carrots, right? Are they both food? Sure, in the most crude, mundane sense, I'll grant you that. But, the effects they have are very, very different. And so I wanted to see kind of what it was that they were talking about with these things. So I experimented with, acid and mushrooms, and was able to essentially see what they're talking about to some degree. And it was pretty profound. And I was able to oh, okay. but you really start to, because how I would describe it when they have those spiritual experiences and stuff, you kind of, your consciousness operates different, right? So we're used to operating in like what I'd consider, three-dimensional consciousness. On these things, it's more like four-dimensional. It's really different. Where something like alcohol makes you kind of dumb, these things make you hyper-aware, and they really feel like you're opening your mind. And it was incredible and stuff when I was like, okay, I kind of got that ego death and that sense when you try to look for yourself and you find the center and realize like it's not really there, more like Buddhist ego death. But what was also interesting is that I got an ensemble of actors in my head, right, where each of my emotions was kind of its own personality. Have you seen Inside Out?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like that, right? But rather than being, the girl or whoever that was being driven by these things, I was now the audience watching the movie and like seeing these, sub-actors within this girl kind of talk and do things and socialize and communicate. It was really interesting and stuff, and that like how each emotion was kind of its own personality. The positive emotions like empathy, happiness, joy, ecstasy, gratitude, and then also ones that we generally consider more negative: disgust, envy, fear, hate, anger. And what was crazy is
you saw this on a trip?
No, it was on a trip and stuff. And essentially just kind of this, because my vision and stuff, was like kaleidoscope, fractal images and stuff. But what was going on and stuff audibly or, listening to these things, it was interesting in the sense that it was like, oh, okay. I was able to, because like I said, my point earlier on, you can't think your thoughts before you think them. So how do you know which one gets through, like which thoughts? And, generally too, our thoughts tend to follow our emotions. Like if you're feeling happy, you tend to have relatively positive thoughts. Or if you're feeling angry, you feel angry thoughts like, oh, screw that guy, right? Like you have these thoughts that come into your head and stuff that kind of follow your emotions. So it was crazy and stuff in the sense that it was like, wow, this is kind of like that background committee that's going on. And I noticed when I was in a positive mood, right, like the positive voices were louder, right? It's like they were all jiving, getting along, having a good time. But if I felt scared, the negative ones started to get louder. I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting, right? It acted in some ways like an amplifier, but also too, I was sneaking in on like this meeting. And so it was interesting and stuff in the sense that a lot of people just write these things off, but it's like people have profound experiences on these things, and that they've been a big part of the development of evolution, of religion and culture for thousands of years. And so it was really interesting to see like, okay, suddenly a burning bush in the desert and hearing voices doesn't sound so crazy anymore. And how and stuff like, okay, I can, and which is what some people think happened to some degree, because there's like this bush out there that's pretty prominent and you light it on fire and it starts to kind of like, the smoke can make you kind of hallucinate. So it's really interesting the effects and stuff that these different things which we kind of co-evolved with can have on our state of consciousness. And it took me to places that I had never felt. But it's crazy in the sense that these things break you down and then they build you back up. And depending on the environment, because having a good or bad trip is entirely dictated upon your environment. If you're in a good environment, you'll have a good trip. If you're in a bad environment, you'll have a bad trip. And the changes it can bring and stuff, I can see why now people who take these things quit smoking, or that they think about things differently. To me, it's crazy because you're really kind of tapping into this deeper part of you that is mostly hidden, but now you're kind of able to engage it in a more direct way, if that makes sense. Yeah. Like I said, I try not to just come across as like a druggie, but like with these things, but it, in the same way, yeah.
The whole time you're talking, I'm thinking that I'm thinking in my mind, I need to find a doctor or someone that's qualified to give Earth something so that she can get through her depression and get over it.
Yes. Yeah, do that. They do that with different treatments and stuff in different countries. Because they successfully use that. It wasn't until and stuff, like I said, you got the hippies in the 60s who would take it and then, stare at the sun and burn out their retinas that, it was like, okay, yeah, but nobody's ever OD'd on shrooms or mushrooms, ever. There's not, and for shrooms and stuff, like, they found, like, there's not a dangerous dose, right? Like, obviously you wouldn't want to abuse anything in my book and stuff. Even like, you drink too much water, you can die. But the fact is that, the fact that these things and stuff, like, nobody's ever killed themselves on. And the fact that people...
I thought there were certain things that were, like, toxic and died from that effectively super high person that died.
Oh, no. So, like, what we consider and stuff, like mushrooms and acid and stuff, can't. The only time... There were some people who apparently got close is they took, like, a shit ton of acid, right? Like, a ton of acid. But they all lived. They did go to the hospital for a bit and stuff to, like, get monitored and their pulses checked and make, a possible IV or anything like that. But nobody's ever, like, OD'd on these things. Now, I'm not saying that nobody's ever, like, taken something and driven themselves off a bridge, but what I am saying and stuff is that, like, from a medical standpoint, nobody's ever OD'd on this. The literature on this is pretty clear. You can even go into something like Wikipedia and just kind of check and like, oh, yep, sure enough, nobody's ever actually, like, OD'd on these things. I mean, that's not to say there aren't.
Permanently retarded,
no, nobody's,
No?
So there are, yeah, I will caution though, because like with anything, there's, like I said, the difference between a good and bad trip is really the environment. And I've been a good guide and stuff for people who've come over and wanted to, like, experience things because I'm pretty good at creating an environment. And, but I have researched and stuff, like there was a guy talking about, so people who essentially have a predisposition to severe manic bipolar and schizophrenia should probably not play around with those, right? Because that can be a trigger. And he says, though, to be fair, we don't know what, essentially because anything can be a trigger for somebody who's got bipolar or schizophrenia. And so, like, the safest thing that they try to do is just like, okay, like, we just keep them off of everything. But for people who don't have a predisposition to schizophrenia or bipolar, people who are suffering just from anxiety, and not just, it makes it sound like I'm belittling it, but people suffering from anxiety or depression or PTSD or, addiction, is that they can use these things with great success in very profound, life-changing ways. To me and stuff, like, it was just really powerful, and it made sense a lot of, like, kind of like that deeper realm that you were kind of just talking about on how there's something more. And it's like, yeah, I do think there's something more. I think consciousness is incredible. And like Sam Harris says, consciousness is the one thing that can't be in an illusion, right? You and I could be in the matrix and everything that we consider empirical reality could be wrong. But the fact that we're still having an experience, even if it is a quote unquote false experience, is still happening, right? So consciousness itself is the one thing in life that we know can't be in an illusion, right? Because we're having an experience, right? It's undeniable. And it's crazy because it's for everybody at the subjective level, right? So I have to grant that when I'm looking out through my eyes and whatnot, that I have to make the assumption that you're having a similar experience. And it's just profound and stuff what consciousness is capable of. And so for me and stuff, like, I don't know, I have a very deep respect and awe and appreciation and stuff for reality and just how magnificent that is, that as we continue to pull back reality, we keep discovering more and more that it's bigger than we ever thought it was. So I try to keep that open mind when I engage reality, but to me that doesn't mean I have to appeal to magic or aka the supernatural, right? Because the natural is already more super than we give it credit for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. No, it's good.
I wonder if religion, in a effect is a way of naturally obtaining those highs, without substance.
Yeah, well, I think it's both, right? So I think, because you can get similar experience, because I've had experiences too that I'd consider just as profoundly religious, being, secular, that were very powerful, but also too, like, seeing, like, okay, I can, because people, like I said, they like to shit on people, like, this was just some crazy man in the desert who was, lighting bushes on fire. And it's like, the thing is too, is I think we're too quick to write off people as like schizophrenic or crazy when they have things like this, because having seen what consciousness is capable of, both from a religious point of view and then from an enhanced with, psychedelics point of view, it's incredible. And I think, like I said, people are too quick to write off people as just being crazy and whatnot, because it's like, no, I've had pretty profound experiences, both being religious and non-religious. And I've also seen what consciousness is capable of, and it's capable of a hell of a lot more than I thought it was. And it's pretty nuts. And people, too, can achieve, like you alluded to, this kind of ego death and this kind of, crazy spiritual experiences without the use of psychedelics. Like people who meditate a lot, for example, for hours, or go into retreats and other things, like, have achieved similar kind of states of, expanding their consciousness. But where I think the utility of psychedelics comes into play, as kind of Sam Harris brings up, is like, but it's hard for people to realize how big that can get, or what that how big that experience could potentially be, without maybe breaking through that epistemological barrier with something like a psychedelic. And so that's where, for me and stuff, I was really curious to see what he meant with that, because I felt like, well, I've had pretty damn profound spiritual experiences and visions and other shit before when I was religious. It's like, what the hell is he talking about? This kind of sense here. And then I was like, oh, okay. That I see exactly what he's talking about now. Wow, that's incredible. And like I said, for me, anytime I go through one of these experiences and stuff, because it's something I don't know, in best terms possible, would consider spiritual, it's crazy, because it is life changing. You feel like you do change in a lot of ways for the better. It's not to say I'm not an asshole at times. I totally still am an asshole, but I feel like in a lot of ways I've become less of an asshole, or that I've been changed in other ways because of my experiences. And yeah, they're pretty powerful. So I feel when Jordan Peterson is talking about the power of like psychedelics and stories and religions and myths, I totally get that. But for me and stuff, like, El is no more valid than Odin, and Jesus is no more valid than Thor or Krishna or any of these, right? I think, and that's not to shit on any of them, right? Like, to me and stuff, it's to show how powerful these ideas are and stuff when we try to emulate them and to adopt them into our subconscious of the idea of the abstract ideal. The problem is, though, is like I said, people can rationalize bad behavior based on certain dogmas and doctrines, right? Like that oak tree model, where you can justify bad behavior under the guise of quote unquote good religion, right? The kind of ends justifies the means religion, which to me is very scary, because that's also the similar mindset that the Soviets had, and the Stalinists had, Nietzsche had. You got to break some eggs to make an omelet and stuff. And it's kind of scary, because I see that kind of talked to in the Me Too movement. So what if, like, we just have to accept the fact that there are going to be people who get falsely accused of rape, and their lives destroyed, but that's the price we pay for increased awareness. I'm like, Jesus, right? Like, I guess when you look at it from that kind of cold perspective, but to be that individual who has their life destroyed is a different matter, right? Like, you talk about it like they're a pawn on a chessboard, right? Like, shit, gotta lose my pawn if I want to win the game. It's like, Jesus, they look at it, reality with a very zero-sum game point of view, and I think that kind of internal accounting is scary. right? It's the same kind of accounting that the hijackers use to justify ramming themselves into buildings at 400 miles per hour, right? It's the same kind of justification people use and stuff. It's like for the greater good. And like I said, that kind of talk and that kind of rhetoric is very alarming anytime I hear it being spouted, because nobody wants to be that individual who gets their life destroyed, yet they're willing to all but willingly sacrifice that person's life for their quote-unquote greater good. And I just think that kind of utilitarian calculus is scary.
Cool. Well, thanks for chatting, man. I'm kind of wishing that I had recorded the conversation so that other people could listen in, because I feel like it's something that could be beneficial to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I have a voice recorder app that kind of just is on my phone when I call people. I'm not sure if it was on right now, but if it is, I'll let you know.
I would love that if it is.
Yeah. Well, sounds good, mate. It was good talking with you.